Before we begin, if you have a love for the forgotten corners of the past, the stories that slipped through the cracks of the history books, then you're in exactly the right place. Consider subscribing to the Hidden History Society and ringing that bell, because everything we uncover here is the kind of history they never taught you in school. Now, let me take you to Ireland. Not the Ireland of postcards and pub songs, but the older one, the buried one, the one that whispers. Ireland is a small island on the far western edge of Europe. For centuries, outsiders imagined it as a remote and simple place, green fields, mist, and little else. But beneath that soft green surface lies one of the deepest and strangest historical records anywhere in the world. This is a land where the dead were honored with monuments older than the pyramids of Egypt, a land whose language and legends preserve fragments of a world that has otherwise vanished entirely. Today, we are going to dig beneath the myth and walk through the lost and hidden history of Ireland. Let us begin at the beginning, with a mound of earth in a quiet river valley and a shaft of light that has not missed its appointment for more than 5,000 years. In the valley of the River Boyne, north of Dublin, there sits a great circular mound called Newgrange. To the untrained eye, it looks like a grassy hill ringed with pale stone. But Newgrange was built around 3,200 years before the birth of Christ. That makes it older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was raised by a farming people whose names we will never know, using nothing but stone tools, muscle, and an astonishing understanding of the heavens. The mound is not a random pile of earth. It is an instrument. A long, narrow passage runs into its heart, ending in a cross-shaped chamber. And above the entrance, the builders left a small opening, a box of stone they carefully aligned. For most of the year, that chamber sits in total darkness. But on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, as the sun rises over the Boyne Valley, a single beam of light creeps down that passage inch by inch until for about 17 minutes it floods the inner chamber with a golden glow. Then it fades, and the darkness returns for another year. Think about what that means. A people with no writing, no metal, no wheel as we would recognize it, understood the movement of the sun so precisely that they could build a machine of stone to catch it, and it still works today. What was it for? A tomb, certainly, for human bone was found within, but also, surely, a promise. In the deepest cold of winter, the message was carved into the very landscape. The light will return. The sun is not gone forever. Life will come again. That is one of the oldest human ideas we can still touch with our own hands. And Newgrange does not stand alone. The whole valley is scattered with monuments, Nowth, Dowth, and dozens of smaller sites covered in spirals, lozenges, and zigzags carved into the stone. We do not fully understand this art. It may be a calendar, a map of the stars, a record of visions, or a language we have simply lost the key to. It stares back at us across 5,000 years, beautiful and silent.
And not far from these mounds rises another kind of sacred place, the Hill of Tara. Today, it looks like little more than a series of grassy ridges and low banks in a green field. You could walk across it and never guess what it once was. But for over 1,000 years, Tara was the ceremonial heart of Ireland, the seat of the High Kings, the sacred center where power itself was made holy. On its summit stands a single weathered standing stone, the Leah Fall, the stone of destiny. Legend says that when the true king of Ireland placed his hands upon it, the stone would cry out in joy, a roar heard across the whole island. Kings were not simply crowned at Tara, they were, in the old belief, wedded to the land itself, married to the goddess of sovereignty. When you understand that, you realize the Irish did not see kingship as mere politics. They saw it as a bond between a ruler and the living earth beneath him. That idea is almost entirely forgotten today, yet the hill still remains, quietly waiting in its field. Now I must take you somewhere darker and stranger, down into the bogs. Ireland is covered in peat bogs, soft, wet, acidic ground that has been slowly forming for thousands of years. And the bog has a peculiar power. It does not let things rot. Over the centuries, workers cutting peat for fuel began to find bodies. Not skeletons, bodies. Skin, hair, fingernails, even the contents of the stomach, preserved for 2,000 years or more. We call them the Bog Bodies. Some of them are Iron Age men who died violent, deliberate deaths, struck down, bound, and placed carefully into the water. Many scholars believe they were sacrifices, perhaps failed kings or chosen victims, offered to the gods or to the land in times of crisis. One of them, found in County Offaly, still wears an elaborate hairstyle held in place with a resin imported from far across the sea, a sign he was likely of high rank. These silent faces, rising out of the black earth after 20 centuries, are among the most haunting witnesses to Ireland's lost beliefs that we will ever have. And here is one more forgotten treasure before we move on: a lost alphabet. Long before the monks arrived with their Latin letters, the early Irish devised a writing system all their own, called Ogham. It looks nothing like our writing. It is a series of straight lines and notches carved along the edge of a standing stone. Strokes to the left, strokes to the right, strokes cutting across. Hundreds of these Ogham stones still survive across Ireland, mostly carved with names. The name of a person, a family, a claim to land, cut into stone 1,500 years ago. It is the earliest form of the Irish language we possess, a whisper of individual human beings reaching us directly from a world that left almost nothing else behind. Now let us move forward in time to a people who left us not stone, but stories: the Celts. Somewhere in the last 1,000 years before Christ, a culture we call Celtic took root across Ireland. They brought iron, art of extraordinary swirling beauty, and a society ruled by warrior kings and a learned class of priests, poets, and lawgivers known as the Druids. Here is the first great tragedy of Irish history. The Druids wrote almost nothing down. Their knowledge, law, genealogy, astronomy, ritual, poetry, was held entirely in memory, passed from teacher to student over years of training. When their world faded, much of that knowledge simply evaporated. What we know of them comes mostly from outsiders and from fragments preserved centuries later.
And yet, Ireland holds a rare gift. The Roman Empire, which conquered and reshaped so much of Europe, never came here. The legions crossed into Britain, but they never sailed the short distance across the Irish Sea in force. And because Rome never came, Ireland's older Celtic world was never stamped out. It bent, it changed, but it survived. This is why the Irish language and Irish mythology preserve echoes of a pre-Roman Europe that has been erased almost everywhere else. When you read the old Irish tales, you are hearing distant cousins of stories that were told across the ancient Celtic world. Stories that only Ireland kept alive. And what stories they are! Tales of the Tuatha De Danann, a supernatural race said to have arrived in Ireland on a great cloud, masters of magic and craft. Tales of the hero Cuchulainn, who single-handedly held off an entire army at a river ford. Tales of Queen Meb, whose greed for a prize bull sparked a legendary war. These were not simply entertainment, they were history, philosophy, and identity, woven together and remembered aloud for 1,000 years before anyone thought to write them down. Which brings us to the people who finally did: the monks. In the 5th century, Christianity came to Ireland, carried by missionaries. The most famous of them, a man we now call Saint Patrick, who himself had first arrived on the island as a kidnapped slave. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of Western civilization,
and one that is far too often forgotten. As the Roman Empire collapsed across Europe, cities burned, libraries were lost, and literacy itself began to disappear across much of the continent. But out on that quiet island at the edge of the world, in cold stone monasteries on windswept hills, Irish monks were doing something extraordinary. They were writing. They copied the Christian scriptures, yes, but they also copied the works of the ancient world, the Latin and Greek learning that was being lost elsewhere. And, crucially, they wrote down their own native tales, the pagan myths of the Tuatha De Danann and Cuchulainn, even though those stories came from an older, non-Christian world. These monks produced objects of breathtaking beauty. The Book of Kells, created around the year 800, is a copy of the four Gospels so intricately decorated that people once believed it could only have been made by angels. Its pages swarm with spirals, knots, animals, and hidden faces, in colors that still glow after 12 centuries. It survives today, one of Ireland's greatest treasures. There is a phrase for this age. It has been said that the Irish saved civilization. That is a bold claim, and historians rightly debate it. But there is a real truth at its heart. In a dark and chaotic age, this small island became a lamp. Irish monks not only preserved learning at home, but they sailed back out across Europe, founding monasteries and schools from France to Switzerland to Italy, carrying literacy and books back into a continent that had begun to forget them. The light, once again, returned from the west.
But no light burns undisturbed forever. And now our story turns darker, to the sea and to the sails on the horizon. Around the year 795, long ships appeared off the Irish coast. The Vikings had come. At first they came to raid, striking the wealthy, undefended monasteries, carrying off gold, books, and slaves. The very monasteries that had preserved civilization now became targets. Round towers still stand across the Irish countryside today, tall, narrow stone fingers pointing at the sky. For a long time their purpose was debated, but many believed they served as watchtowers and refuges, places to shelter people and treasures when the raiders came. And here is something that lies, quite literally, beneath the feet of modern Ireland. Scattered across the countryside are thousands of circular earthen banks, ringed with trees, that farmers for centuries have refused to touch. They are called fairy forts, or raths. Country people believe them to be the homes of the fairies, the AOC, and to disturb one would bring terrible bad luck. Roads have been rerouted to avoid them. Farmers have left them standing in the middle of otherwise cleared fields. But here is the hidden truth. These are not fairy dwellings at all. They are the remains of early medieval farmsteads, ringed enclosures where families lived over 1,000 years ago. And beneath many of them lie souterrains, hidden underground tunnels and stone chambers, dug as places to hide from raiders or to store food in the cool earth. So a superstition, a fear of the fairies, ended up doing what archaeologists could only dream of. It protected thousands of ancient sites, untouched for 1,000 years. Sometimes a legend is history in disguise, quietly guarding the very thing it seems to hide. But here is what the schoolbook version often leaves out. The Vikings did not only destroy, they stayed. They built Ireland's first true towns, including a settlement they called Difflin, which we know today as Dublin. Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, Cork, some of Ireland's greatest cities began as Viking ports. They brought coinage, trade routes that stretched from Ireland to the Middle East, and a new energy to the island. Over generations, the fierce raiders became merchants, neighbors, and eventually simply part of the mixed and layered people of Ireland. The invaders became the invaded, absorbed into the island they had once terrorized. This is a pattern we will see again and again in Irish history. Ireland, conquered, and yet somehow, culturally, refusing to disappear. Now we come to the longest and most painful chapter,
the centuries of conquest, and the shadow that still shapes Ireland today. But before we reach that long defeat, let me tell you about one figure who refused to bow. A woman the history books long tried to forget. Her name was Grace O'Malley, and in the 16th century, she was quite simply a pirate queen. Along the wild western coast of Ireland, she commanded a fleet of ships and hundreds of fighting men. She raided, she traded, she taxed anyone who dared sail through her waters, and she led her men into battle in person. Legend says she gave birth to a son at sea, and the very next day rose from her bed to fight off an attack by pirates. When the English tightened their grip and captured members of her family, Grace did something astonishing. She sailed to England and demanded a face-to-face meeting with Queen Elizabeth I herself. Two powerful women from two clashing worlds spoke as equals, reportedly in Latin, since Grace spoke no English and Elizabeth no Irish. For centuries, her story was pushed to the margins, dismissed as folklore. But she was entirely real, and she remains one of the most extraordinary figures Ireland ever produced.
And yet, one woman with a fleet could not turn back the tide of history. In the 12th century came the Normans from England, and after them wave upon wave of English power. Over the following centuries, England sought to control and then to colonize the island next door. Irish land was confiscated and given to English and Scottish settlers. The old Gaelic aristocracy, the chieftains and poets who had carried Ireland's ancient culture, were broken and scattered. In 1607, in an event remembered as the Flight of the Earls, the last great Gaelic lords sailed away into exile in Europe, and an old world effectively came to an end. And with that world went the language. For most of its history, the people of Ireland spoke Irish, a Celtic tongue, one of the oldest living languages in Europe, the very language that carried all those ancient tales. But under English rule, Irish was pushed to the margins, discouraged in schools, and associated with poverty and backwardness. Then came the catastrophe. In the 1840s, a disease destroyed Ireland's potato crop, the food on which the poorest millions depended. The result was the Great Famine. Around 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another million or more fled across the ocean, mostly to America, in ships so deadly they were called coffin ships. In just a few years, Ireland lost roughly a quarter of its entire population. Whole villages emptied. You can still walk the Irish countryside today and find the outlines of abandoned homes, stone walls softened by grass, the footprints of families who either died or sailed away and never returned. The famine did something else, something quieter and more lasting. It struck hardest in the poorest, most rural areas, which were exactly the places where the Irish language was still strongest. When those communities died or emigrated, the language went with them. English, already the tongue of law, commerce, and survival, swept across the island. A language that had endured for thousands of years, that had outlasted the Romans and the Vikings, was brought to the edge of extinction, not by conquest alone, but by hunger. And this is perhaps the deepest hidden history of all. Not a lost monument or a forgotten king, but a lost way of seeing the world. When a language fades, we do not simply lose words. We lose the songs that only rhyme in that tongue, the jokes that only work in its grammar, the names that the land itself was given by the people who first loved it. Across Ireland, the old place names still carry meaning in Irish: a hill of the fairies, a ford of the oaks, a field of the battle, meaning that most who pass by today can no longer read. The landscape is a book,
written in a language that was nearly forgotten. But nearly is not the same as fully, and here at last our story turns back toward the light. Ireland did not vanish. Against staggering odds, the island endured, and in the 20th century won its independence. And with that freedom came something remarkable, a deliberate, determined effort to reach back and reclaim what had been buried. Scholars translated the ancient manuscripts the monks had saved. The Irish language, though still fragile, was taught again, spoken again, sung again. Archaeologists returned to Newgrange and cleared away the centuries. And today, each winter solstice, people gather once more to watch that ancient shaft of light complete its 5,000-year-old journey into the heart of the mound.
The hidden history of Ireland is not really a history of loss, though there is loss in it. It is a history of survival, of a small island that was raided, conquered, starved, and silenced, and that, again and again, refused to be erased. The monuments still stand, the stories are still told, the light still returns. And that is why places like this matter, because history is not gone, it is simply hidden, waiting under the grass, inside the old words, behind the carved spirals, for someone willing to look. So, if this journey into Ireland's buried past moved you, do this before you go. Subscribe to the Hidden History Society and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story we bring back into the light. Leave a comment and tell us, which hidden chapter of the world's past should we uncover next? And if you know someone who feels the pull of the forgotten places, share this with them. History belongs to those who remember it. Thank you for walking through the past with us, and until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.